Steve Harvey stopped everything when a player said, "You don't belong here," to him. And in that moment, just a few seconds of silence on a stage he's controlled for decades, something inside him shattered. Because the player wasn't talking about the game show. He was talking about something much deeper. Something Steve had spent his entire life running from. What happened next forced him to confront a question he'd been avoiding his whole career. Did he ever actually belong anywhere at all? This is the story of how one sentence unraveled everything Steve Harvey had built. It was just another taping day on the Family Feud set. The lights were perfect. The audience was warm and ready to laugh. Steve Harvey walked out in his signature tailored suit, navy blue, crisp, expensive, and the crowd erupted. They always did. After all these years, after all these tapings, it never got old for them. The energy in that studio was electric, and Steve fed off it like oxygen. He knew exactly what he was doing. He'd done it thousands of times. The greeting, the joke that landed right on cue, the laugh from the audience that came exactly when he expected it. The contestants walking out, nervous and excited, ready to play for their families. Steve would make them comfortable. He'd charm them. He'd make them feel seen, heard, valued. This was his domain. He moved through the opening with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra he'd memorized note by note. Every gesture calculated, every pause deliberate, every smile genuine enough to feel real but polished enough to look perfect. The audience didn't just watch Steve Harvey. They trusted him. He was the authority, the warm presence, the guy who had all the answers. He introduced the first family. They were excited, nervous, exactly as they should be. Steve asked them their names. He asked them where they were from. He found the human detail, something about them that made them more than just contestants. That was his gift. That was what made him different from other hosts. He didn't just move people through a game. He connected with them. The game started. The questions came. The answers were funny, sometimes crude, sometimes surprisingly clever. Steve laughed, genuinely laughed. But he was also managing the energy, keeping it moving, making sure it never sagged. This was a performance, yes, but it was a performance he'd perfected so completely that the line between performance and authenticity had blurred beyond recognition. Then it was time for the second family. They came out. Steve did his thing, the charm, the connection, the warmth. A father, a mother, a young adult son. The son was quiet, maybe in his mid-20s, with an intensity in his eyes that suggested he was actually paying attention, not just playing along like most people did. The game progressed. The questions came. Fast money approached. And then, between rounds, during a casual moment that wasn't supposed to mean anything, the son leaned toward Steve with a small smile and said it. "You don't belong here." The words hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water. For a moment, and it was only a moment, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, Steve didn't move. His smile stayed in place. His posture remained perfect. But something inside him seized. Something inside him recognized the weight of what had just been said. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't aggressive. The kid had said it with a kind of knowing calmness, like he was stating a fact everyone could see, but nobody was willing to acknowledge. Like he was pointing at the emperor and noticing out loud that the clothes weren't quite right. The audience didn't fully catch it. The energy kept moving. But Steve caught it. He felt it. And for the first time in perhaps longer than he could remember, Steve Harvey's perfect control cracked just slightly. He recovered instantly. The professional in him kicked back in. He moved forward with the game. he stayed, in character. He finished the taping like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Because as the show continued around him, as the audience laughed and the lights stayed bright and the machinery of entertainment kept grinding forward, Steve Harvey found himself thinking about those 6 words in a way he couldn't quite push aside. You don't belong here. Not an accusation, an observation. And the worst part, the thing that made it cut so deep, was that some part of him, some small voice he'd been training himself to ignore for 30 years, whispered back, he's right. The taping ended. The audience applauded. Steve took his bow. He smiled and waved and shook hands and did all the things he was supposed to do. The machine had finished its cycle. Time to reset for the next taping. But this time, something was different. This time, the words wouldn't leave him alone. But what made those words so devastating wasn't just what was said. It was what they awakened inside him. That night, Steve Harvey sat in his dressing room alone. The makeup was off. The suit jacket was draped over a chair. The persona was still there, though. It always was. Even alone, he carried it with him like a second skin he couldn't quite shed. He kept replaying the moment. You don't belong here. Over and over. Not obsessively, but with a kind of gravitational pull he couldn't escape. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized something terrifying. The kid had touched a nerve that went deeper than just a game show. Because Steve Harvey did belong on that stage. He'd earned it. Thousands of hours of work, decades of building a brand, an empire, a name that meant something to millions of people. He belonged there the way a surgeon belongs in an operating room, through mastery, through repetition, through absolute command of the space. But the kid wasn't talking about the game show. Steve knew this with a certainty that made his chest tight. The kid was talking about something else, something older, something buried so deep that Steve had spent 30 years building walls around it so he wouldn't have to think about it. He stood up and walked to the mirror. The man looking back at him was successful, polished, powerful, silver-haired and distinguished. A man who had everything figured out. A man people listened to. A man who gave advice about life, relationships, success. Who people trusted to have answers. But underneath all of that, underneath the tailored suits and the perfect timing and the practiced charm, there was someone else. Someone younger, rawer. Someone Steve hadn't seen in so long he'd almost forgotten what that person looked like. The young Steve Harvey, the stand-up comedian. The thought hit him like a punch. When did I stop being that guy? He could remember him, though. The version of himself from decades ago. The comedian who didn't care about being liked, who cared about being true, who would say things on stage that made people uncomfortable because discomfort was where the real comedy lived, where the real truth lived. That Steve Harvey would walk into a room and command it, not because he'd learned the perfect formula, but because he had something to say, something raw, something unfiltered, something that came from a place so honest it sometimes made people angry. But that Steve Harvey was dangerous, that Steve Harvey couldn't be packaged, couldn't be monetized as easily, couldn't appeal to sponsors and networks and the kind of massive audiences that wanted to be comforted, not challenged. So somewhere along the way, Steve couldn't even pinpoint exactly when. He'd made a choice. Not consciously, maybe. Not as a deliberate decision, but a choice nonetheless. He'd buried that guy. He'd taken the raw edges and smoothed them down. He'd taken the dangerous honesty and wrapped it in charm. He'd taken the comedian who wanted to provoke and transformed him into an entertainer who wanted to please. And it had worked. God, how it had worked. The success had come rushing in like a flood. The money, the fame, the respect, the authority, the ability to tell millions of people how to live their lives. But somewhere in all that success, he'd lost something. He'd lost that guy. The stand-up comic. The one who wasn't afraid to say uncomfortable things. The one who didn't need permission to exist. The one who belonged to himself first and everyone else second. Steve stared at his reflection in the mirror. And for just a moment, he tried to see past the polish. He tried to look for that younger version of himself underneath all the success and refinement and carefully constructed identity. He almost couldn't find him. The realization was cold and sharp. I've spent 30 years becoming someone I don't recognize. And the kid on the game show stage, some kid he'd never met before and would probably never see again, had somehow managed to point directly at the thing Steve had been running from his entire career. Because the kid was right. The polished, perfect, in-control Steve Harvey didn't belong on that stage. Not really, not authentically. The person who belonged on that stage was the one Steve had killed off years ago, the dangerous one, the real one, the comedian. And Steve knew, in that moment, that the contestant was right about something much deeper than anyone realized. Steve Harvey had built his life on transformation. It wasn't something he'd done once. It was something he'd done over and over again. Each reinvention more calculated than the last. Each new identity carefully constructed to serve a specific purpose, to open a specific door, to make him valuable in a specific way. He sat in his home office the next morning, coffee going cold in his hand, and he began to count them. Not out loud, just in his mind. The different versions of Steve Harvey that had existed over the decades. First, there was the young stand-up comedian. Raw, hungry, willing to say anything for a laugh. That Steve Harvey belonged in dark clubs with sticky floors and drunk audiences who didn't care about polish. That Steve Harvey had something to prove. That Steve Harvey was angry in a way he didn't fully understand. And he channeled that anger into comedy because it was the only thing that made sense. He'd stand on those stages night after night, feeling the weight of his own inadequacy, his own hunger, his own desperate need to matter. And he'd transform all of it into words, into jokes, into moments where the audience would laugh so hard they'd forget their own problems. In those moments, on those stages, with those audiences, he felt real. He felt like he existed, like his existence had weight. Then came the next version, the one who realized that anger could be softened, that if he took the edge off his comedy just slightly, he could reach bigger audiences, he could get better gigs, he could start appearing on television. That Steve Harvey learned to be likable without losing his edge entirely. He found the sweet spot between provocative and acceptable. The formula, he discovered, was simple. You could say dangerous things as long as you said them with a smile. You could challenge people as long as you made them feel loved while you were doing it. You could be honest as long as you wrapped the honesty in charm. This version of Steve Harvey was a mathematician of the human psyche. He studied what worked, what made people uncomfortable but not too uncomfortable, what made them laugh but not at something that would actually matter. He was learning to be strategic about his authenticity, which, he would later realize, was the moment authenticity had died. Then came the next transformation. The divorce, the struggle, the moment when being an edgy comedian wasn't enough anymore. He needed stability. He needed money. He needed to be someone respectable. So he became the guy who could host Star Search. The guy who could be on television in a way that didn't scare people. That Steve Harvey learned to smile bigger and talk softer and make everyone around him feel comfortable. He learned to take his natural charisma, which had once been a weapon, and turn it into a tool of comfort. He learned to ask questions that made people feel heard rather than challenged. He learned to validate rather than provoke. And somewhere in that process, he felt something shift inside him. A quieting, a settling, a slow erasure of the sharp edges that had once defined him. He told himself it was maturity, growth, evolution. But deep down, in a place he'd learned not to listen to, a voice whispered that it was actually surrender. Then the family feud years began, and with them came a new Steve Harvey, the warm father figure, the moral authority, the guy who knew the right thing to say in every situation, the guy whose primary job wasn't to make people laugh anymore. It was to make them feel seen, to make them feel like they mattered, to be the safe presence in the room. This version of Steve Harvey was perfected through thousands of interactions. He learned which questions would make someone open up, which jokes would land just right, which pauses would make a moment feel sincere. He became a master of emotional manipulation, not in a cynical sense, but in a technical sense. He could read a room the way a musician reads a score. He could conduct the emotional tone of an entire interaction. And people loved him for it. They trusted him. They felt safe with him. They confessed their deepest insecurities to him on national television because he had created an atmosphere of such perfect acceptance that vulnerability felt safe. He was giving people something real, the experience of being truly heard. But there was a cost. The cost was that he never had to be vulnerable. He never had to expose himself. He was the one doing the accepting, which meant he was always in control. He was always protected. The mask had become so effective that it had become his actual face. And then, most recently, the lifestyle guru, the relationship expert, the man who wrote books about what makes a good relationship, the man who dispensed wisdom about love and success and purpose to millions of people. That Steve Harvey had all the answers. That Steve Harvey knew things. That Steve Harvey had figured life out in a way that gave him the authority to tell other people how to figure theirs out. He'd taken everything he'd learned, every observation, every insight, every piece of wisdom he'd accumulated, and he'd packaged it into a product, a brand, a commodity. And it had sold millions. People bought his books. People came to his seminars. People listened to his advice on relationships and money and purpose. And they believed him because he spoke with such certainty, such conviction, such absolute confidence that he knew the way forward. But the thing Steve had never had to answer, the thing he'd carefully avoided, was how much of this advice comes from actual wisdom, and how much of it comes from the need to maintain the image of a man who has it all figured out. If he admitted uncertainty, what happened to the brand? If he showed vulnerability, what happened to the authority? If he revealed that he was still struggling with the same questions as everyone else, what happened to the empire he'd built on being the guy who had the answers? Each transformation had required something. Each one had demanded the death of the previous version. You couldn't be the raw stand-up comic and also be the warm family entertainer. Those people lived in fundamentally different emotional spaces. The comic needed to create distance and tension. The entertainer needed to create intimacy and comfort. The comic said, "Wake up and pay attention." The entertainer said, "You're safe here." These were opposite directives. They required opposite states of being. You couldn't be the edgy provocateur and also be the moral authority. Those identities were built on opposite foundations. One said, I'm here to make you uncomfortable because discomfort is where growth lives. The other said, I'm here to make you safe because safety is where healing lives. You couldn't be both. Not really. Not authentically. So every time Steve Harvey had reinvented himself, he'd had to suppress something. He'd had to bury something. He'd had to kill off a version of himself so that the new version could live. And each time he'd done this, he'd told himself a story about why it was necessary, why it was growth, why the new version was better, more evolved, more sophisticated than the last. But sitting in his office that morning, thinking about what the kid had said, Steve began to wonder if growth and erasure were actually the same thing. Because what if he hadn't been evolving at all? What if he'd just been disappearing? What if every reinvention was just another mask he'd put on? Another layer of distance between himself and the person he actually was? Another way of saying, this version of me is not safe. Hide it, bury it, replace it with something that serves a purpose. He thought about the stand-up comedian. Where had that guy gone? Not just the version of him who performed in clubs, but the part of him that needed to speak truth, that needed to challenge, that needed to be honest, even when honesty was uncomfortable, that needed to provoke a reaction, even when provocation meant people would dislike him. He'd suppressed that in service of being likable. He thought about the angry young man, the one who felt things deeply and wasn't afraid to show it, the one whose anger wasn't just an emotion. It was fuel, motivation, a source of power. Where had he gone? He'd suppressed that in service of being warm and accessible. He thought about the version of himself that admitted uncertainty, that didn't have all the answers, that was willing to say, I don't know, I'm figuring this out too, I'm scared, I'm confused, I'm still trying to understand who I am and what I believe. That version had been especially dangerous to the brand because people didn't want to hear that. They wanted their leaders to be certain. They wanted their authorities to know the way. They wanted their gurus to have already arrived at the destination so they could follow the map. He'd suppressed that in service of being an authority. Steve Harvey had spent 3 decades becoming more and more successful by becoming less and less himself. He'd built an empire on the foundation of multiple personas, each one carefully constructed to be exactly what people needed him to be in that particular moment. And the more successful he'd become, the more trapped he'd felt inside these personas. Not because they were restrictive in the way a prison is restrictive, but because he'd built them so well that nobody could see past them. Not his audiences, not his colleagues, not his family, not even him. The masks had become so perfect that he'd forgotten they were masks. He'd looked in the mirror so many times and seen the polished version staring back that he'd stopped wondering what was underneath. He'd become so accustomed to seeing the persona reflected back at him that the persona had become the reality. The distinction had collapsed. The performance had consumed the performer. And now a kid on a game show stage had said 6 words that had ripped one of those masks slightly askew. You don't belong here. Steve finally understood what the kid was really saying. It wasn't that Steve didn't belong on the stage. It was that Steve didn't belong anywhere. Because the person standing on that stage wasn't actually Steve. It was a carefully constructed collection of personas designed to be acceptable, profitable, and unthreatening. It was a brand, a product, a carefully engineered response to what the market wanted. The real Steve Harvey? The one underneath all the masks. The one who had actual thoughts that weren't. Designed to sell something? The one who had genuine doubts instead of performed certainty? The one who could be wrong without it threatening his entire identity? That guy was a ghost. He'd been a ghost for so long that Steve had stopped believing he was even real. He'd been buried so deep beneath layers of personas and performances that Steve couldn't even remember what his actual voice sounded like. Not the voice he used to entertain people, his actual voice. The one that existed before he learned what the world wanted from him. Steve sat at his desk, the coffee completely cold now, and he felt something crack open inside his chest. The masks hadn't been protection. They'd been cages. But the worst part wasn't the masks themselves. It was the lie underneath all of them. The lie was so foundational that Steve couldn't even remember when he'd started believing it. It might have started in childhood, in those early moments when he realized that being himself, his actual self, with his actual feelings and actual needs, wasn't always safe. When he learned that the world rewarded certain versions of you and punished others. When he understood, at some level too deep for words, that survival meant becoming what people needed you to be. Or maybe it started later. During the early comedy years, when he was struggling and hungry and desperate to matter. When every rejection felt like a referendum on his entire existence. When he realized that if he could just say the right thing, tell the right joke, hit the right note, he could make people like him. He could make people want him. He could matter. But somewhere along the way, the lie had crystallized into something concrete. The lie was this: your value comes from what you provide to other people. It was such a simple lie, so elegant in its simplicity. So easy to believe because it contained just enough truth to be seductive. Yes, it was true that people appreciated what he provided. The entertainment, the warmth, the wisdom, the authority, his ability to make them feel seen and heard and valued. That was real. That was something he provided. But the lie went deeper than that. The lie said, your value comes only from what you provide, which meant, if you're not providing something, you're not valuable, which meant, if you stop performing, you stop existing, which meant, your actual self, the self that exists when nobody's watching, the self that has needs and doubts and fears. That self is worthless. That self is the problem. That self is what you need to hide. So you build the masks. You construct the personas. You learn to read what people need, and you become that thing. And because you're good at it, because you have genuine talent and genuine insight and genuine warmth, it actually works. People respond. They love you. They buy what you're selling. They make you rich and famous and powerful. And you tell yourself that this is success. But what it actually is, what Steve was beginning to understand, sitting in his office with the cold coffee and the weight of 30 years pressing down on him, what it actually is a very sophisticated form of self-erasure. Because every time you perform, you're reinforcing the belief that your actual self isn't good enough. Every time people praise the mask, you're getting evidence that the real you is less valuable than the fake you. Every time you succeed by being what people need, you're teaching yourself that being yourself is a losing strategy. And so you stop trying. You stop even attempting to be yourself, not consciously, just gradually, slowly, naturally, the way a river stops flowing in one direction when a dam is built. Steve thought about the moments when this had been most obvious. There was the time, years ago, when he'd been interviewed and asked about his doubts, about his fears, about the moments when he didn't know what to do. And he'd felt it immediately. The danger. The sense that admitting uncertainty would undermine his authority. So he'd pivoted. He'd made a joke. He'd reframed the question in a way that let him maintain the image of a man who had it figured out. And the interviewer had accepted it. The audience had accepted it. Everyone had moved on. But Steve had felt something in that moment. A small death. A tiny erasure. Another piece of himself sacrificed on the altar of the brand. There was the time when he'd wanted to talk about his faith in a way that was actually complicated and messy and uncertain. But he'd realized that complicated faith doesn't sell books. Clear, confident faith sells books. So he'd simplified it. He'd cleaned it up. He'd made it into something more palatable, more marketable, less true. There was the time when he'd wanted to admit that he didn't have all the answers about relationships, that he was still figuring it out, that sometimes he got it wrong. But he'd realized that admitting that would undermine the entire premise of his relationship advice, business. So he doubled down. He'd become more confident, more certain, more of an authority. Each time he'd told himself it was necessary, it was strategic, it was business. But what it actually was the slow, methodical destruction of his own authenticity. And the thing that made it so insidious was that it worked. The more he erased himself, the more successful he became. The more he hid his actual self, the more people loved him. The more he became what people needed, the more money he made. The more he performed certainty, the more authority he had. So the system reinforced itself. Success became evidence that he was doing the right thing, that the masks were correct, that erasing himself was the correct strategy. What Steve was beginning to understand, what the kid's 6 words had opened up in him, was that he'd built his entire empire on a foundation of self-betrayal. And the empire was so massive, so successful, so thoroughly constructed that he couldn't even see the foundation anymore. He could only see the magnificent structure that rose up from it. The wealth, the fame, the influence, the ability to make millions of people listen to what he had to say. But underneath it all, holding it up, was the constant, exhausting work of being someone he wasn't. That was the cost of the empire. That was what nobody talked about when they discussed his success. Steve thought about his children, about how they'd grown up watching him perform, watching him be what people needed. Had they learned that their value came from what they could provide? Had they learned that their actual selves weren't good enough? He thought about his relationships, about how hard it must have been to actually know him when he'd spent so much energy making sure nobody could see past the mask, about how lonely it must have been to be married to a persona, to love someone who wasn't quite real. He thought about himself, about the 30 years he'd spent not being himself, about the actual Steve Harvey, the one who existed underneath all the masks, the one who had genuine thoughts and genuine doubts and genuine needs. How that person must feel. How buried, how erased, how desperate to finally exist. And the kid on the game show stage had somehow intuited all of this in a single moment. You don't belong here. Not because Steve wasn't good at his job. He was extraordinary at his job. But because the job, the entire construction of the persona, the entire empire built on providing what people needed, was fundamentally at odds with being an actual person. You couldn't be both. You couldn't be authentic and also be what everyone needed you to be. You couldn't be honest and also be an authority. You couldn't be real and also be a brand. The kid had seen this contradiction, and he'd pointed at it. And Steve, for the first time in 30 years, had to acknowledge that the kid was right. The version of Steve Harvey that stood on that stage, the one who belonged to the Yay empire, didn't belong anywhere that actual authenticity mattered. Because that version of Steve Harvey was a lie. And you can build an empire on lies. You can build it big and successful and admired. But you can't live in that empire and still be alive. You can only perform being alive. And Steve had been performing for so long that he'd almost forgotten what actual aliveness felt like. The empire was magnificent, but it was built on the corpse of the person who built it. The decision came on the third night. Steve hadn't slept. Not really. He'd lain in bed, stared at the ceiling, and watched the hours accumulate like debt. His mind kept circling back to the same place, the stage, the kid's face, those 6 words that had somehow cracked open the entire structure of his life. He'd tried to sleep on the first night. He'd gone through the motions, changed into his pajamas, set his alarm, got into bed. But the moment his head hit the pillow, his mind had activated. Not in a normal, thinking way. In a way that felt almost involuntary, like his brain had decided that sleep was a luxury he no longer deserved. The thoughts had come rapid fire, fragmented, painful. You don't belong here. What did that mean exactly? Why had the kid said it? What had he seen in that moment that had compelled him to say something so blunt, so direct, so utterly devoid of the social niceties that usually govern these interactions? Steve had replayed the moment over and over. The kid's expression, the tone of his voice, the way the audience had reacted, the way he had reacted, and underneath all of it, a question that wouldn't go away. Was the kid right? By the second night, the question had evolved. It wasn't any more about whether the kid was right in that specific moment. It had become something bigger, something that threatened the entire architecture of his life. Do I belong anywhere? Because if the Steve Harvey that stood on that game show stage didn't belong there, the one with the perfect smile and the practiced warmth and the carefully calibrated responses, then who was the real Steve Harvey? Where did he belong? And that question had opened up a door that Steve couldn't close. Once you started asking it, you couldn't stop. It led to other questions, darker questions, questions that the successful version of Steve Harvey had learned not to ask. Am I real? Is any of this real? Have I been lying for so long that I don't even know the difference between the lie and the truth anymore? By the third night, something had shifted in him fundamentally. It wasn't a dramatic shift. It wasn't like a lightning bolt moment where everything suddenly became clear and the path forward emerged in brilliant, obvious detail. It was slower than that, more insidious, more like water wearing away at stone over the course of months or years. Thought by thought, realization by realization. The slow, inexorable understanding that the thing he'd spent 30 years building, the empire, the brand, the persona, had cost him something that couldn't be recovered. Something that had no price because it was the only thing that actually mattered. It had cost him himself. And the worst part was, now that he could see it, he couldn't unsee it. It was like someone had handed him a pair of glasses and said, "Look." And he'd put them on, and suddenly the entire world had shifted into focus in a way it never had before. And those glasses couldn't be taken off. Not without blinding yourself to the truth. He saw it in his public persona. The warmth that wasn't actually warmth, but the performance of warmth. Carefully modulated, precisely timed, designed to make people feel a certain way. He could see it now, could see the calculation underneath it, the way he'd learned to read what people needed and deliver exactly that thing in exactly the right quantity. He saw the wisdom that was less about actual insight and more about carefully constructed observations that seemed wise because they were delivered with such confidence. He saw how he'd learned to package complexity into simple, quotable statements that people could repeat back to others. that could be turned into memes and posts and book titles. He saw the authority that was built entirely on the suppression of doubt, on the willingness to speak with certainty about things he was actually uncertain about, on the performance of having arrived at the destination when the truth was, he was still wandering in the wilderness like everyone else. He could see the machinery now, the gears turning behind the smile, the mechanics of the performance, the way each piece fit together in a system designed to create a specific effect in the viewer. And once you could see the machinery, you couldn't believe in the performance anymore. It was like watching a magic trick after the magician had explained how it worked. You could still enjoy the trick, you could still appreciate the skill, but you could never again experience the magic. That sense of genuine wonder, that belief that something impossible had happened right in front of you. It was gone. And Steve understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that this was what the kid had been pointing at. The kid hadn't necessarily been trying to hurt him. He probably hadn't been trying to do anything except point out something he'd noticed, something that didn't add up, some dissonance between the person on the stage and the actual reality of what that person was. But the kid had been right. The Steve Harvey that belonged on that stage, the polished, warm, wise, authoritative version, didn't actually exist. Not really. Not in any meaningful sense. He was a construction, a carefully engineered response to what millions of people wanted and needed. A product designed by market research and focus groups and years of trial and error to deliver a specific emotional experience. And that version, no matter how successful, no matter how loved, no matter how many people it had helped, that version didn't belong anywhere that authenticity mattered. Because that version wasn't real. He got out of bed at 3 a.m. on the third night. He didn't do it consciously. He just became aware suddenly that he was standing, that his feet were on the cold floor, that his body had decided, independent of his conscious will, that lying in bed was no longer an option. He walked through his dark house like a ghost, moving through a familiar haunting, down the stairs, through the kitchen, into his office. He turned on the light and sat in the chair where he spent so much of his time, writing, planning, strategizing, building the empire. And he sat there in the silence. And he made a decision. It was the kind of decision that felt impossible, even as he was making it. The kind of decision that seemed to come from somewhere outside himself. Some deeper part of him that had been waiting for this moment. Some authentic version of himself that had been buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it existed. He would go back. Not to the game show, though maybe that too, eventually. But first, he would go back to the beginning. Back to the moment before the empire. Back to before he'd learned to be what people needed. Back to before he'd understood the formula for success. Back to when he was just a kid with something burning inside him that needed to come out, no idea how to say it or what would happen if he did. He would go back to the comedy, not the polished version he'd performed for so many years. Not the comedy that fit into a brand or a network's requirements or a time slot's constraints or a demographic's expectations. Not the comedy that made people feel comfortable and warm and heard. But the actual comedy. The dangerous kind. The kind that came from a real place. From anger and fear and uncertainty and the desperate need to tell the truth even when the truth was uncomfortable. The kind that challenged instead of comforted, that provoked instead of soothed, that said things that made people squirm because those things needed to be said. The kind that he'd done when he was young and hungry and had nothing to lose. He didn't know if he could even do it anymore. Decades had passed. He'd spent so long learning to be palatable, to be acceptable, to be what people needed. that he didn't know if he still had access to that raw, unfiltered version of himself. He didn't know if that part of him was still alive underneath all the masks and personas and constructed identities. He didn't know if the raw, hungry, angry young comedian who'd once stood on stages in dark clubs and said things that made people uncomfortable, if that person still existed inside him, or if he'd been erased completely. But he had to find out, because the alternative was continuing to perform, continuing to build the empire, continuing to provide what people needed while slowly, methodically erasing the person who was doing the providing, continuing to trade his actual self for the currency of success and approval and fame and influence. And he couldn't do that anymore. Something had broken inside him when the kid said those 6 words. Something fundamental. Something had cracked open in a way that couldn't be repaired by adding another layer to the mask, or refining the persona, or updating the brand. The only way forward wasn't through construction, but through deconstruction. Not through building something new, but through tearing down what was already there. Not through suppression, but through expression. And that terrified him. Because expression meant vulnerability. It meant risking failure. It meant being willing to be disliked. It meant letting people see the parts of him that weren't polished or wise or authoritative. It meant being willing to not have all the answers. It meant being real. Steve stood up and walked to the window of his office. Outside, the city was sleeping. Millions of people, most of them unconscious. Most of them not performing. Most of them just being, even in their sleep. Just existing in their actual selves, without the weight of needing to be something specific, or provide something particular, or maintain some carefully constructed image. He wondered what that felt like. To just be, without the performance, without the calculation, without the constant, exhausting awareness of what people needed and how to provide it, and how to make sure the empire kept growing. To just exist, in your actual form, with your actual doubts and fears and uncertainties, without needing to hide any of it or dress it up or make it palatable. He thought about calling someone, a therapist, a mentor, a trusted friend, someone who could tell him whether this was the right decision, whether going back to being a real person instead of a persona was possible, whether it was too late, whether he was having some kind of breakdown, or whether this was actually the clearest thinking he'd done in years. But then he realized, that's what the old Steve Harvey would do. The one who needed external validation, who needed permission, who needed someone else to confirm that his instincts were correct before he could trust them. The new Steve Harvey, or maybe the old Steve Harvey, the one underneath all the masks, the one that still existed somewhere deep inside. He didn't need permission. He just needed to do it. So he sat down at his desk, and he moved the cold coffee out of the way, and he opened a blank document on his computer. He stared at the blinking cursor. It was just a cursor. A simple thing. A tiny line blinking on and off, on and off. A placeholder for whatever he might say. For the words that wanted to come out. For the truth that wanted to be spoken. And then he started to write. Not a script. Not something carefully constructed for an audience with the goal of producing a specific emotional response. Not words chosen to be quotable or memorable or marketable. Just words. His actual thoughts. His actual doubts, his actual fears, the things he'd been suppressing for 30 years because they didn't fit the brand, because they didn't serve the empire, because they were too real, too raw, too honest, too vulnerable. He wrote about the masks, the first one, the second one, the third one. all the versions of himself he'd constructed over the decades. He wrote about how each one had required the suppression of the previous one, how each reinvention had been, in a very real sense, a small death. He wrote about the cost of reinvention, not in abstract terms, but in specific, painful detail. The relationships damaged because he was never quite himself in them. The opportunities missed because he was always performing instead of actually living. The parts of himself that had atrophied from disuse. The dreams he'd abandoned because they didn't fit the persona. He wrote about the slow erosion of self that happens when you spend decades being what other people need. He wrote about how it starts small. One compromise, one mask, one performance. And then another. And then another. Until you've built such an elaborate structure that you can't even see the foundation anymore. Until the performance has become so complete that you can't remember what you were performing for. He wrote about the emptiness underneath the success. All that money, all that fame, all that influence, all those people who loved him, admired him, wanted to be like him. But none of it filling the actual void inside. Because the void wasn't created by lack of success. It was created by the success itself. By the requirement to be what people needed instead of being what he actually was. He wrote about the loneliness underneath the warmth. How you could be surrounded by people and still be completely alone if none of them were actually seeing you. If all they were seeing was the persona you'd constructed. If the warmth you were offering them was calculated instead of genuine. He wrote about the doubt underneath the authority. How you could speak with such confidence about things you actually weren't sure about. How you could build an entire career, an entire empire, on the willingness to sound certain even when you were terrified. How you could become a leader to millions of people while being completely lost yourself. He wrote about the kid on the game show stage and what that kid had somehow understood in an instant. He wrote about the moment when the words had been said, the way the room had gone quiet, the way he'd felt something shift, the way, even in that moment of shock and defensiveness, part of him had known the kid was right. He wrote about the real Steve Harvey, the one who was terrified, the one who didn't have answers. The one who was still figuring out who he was and what he believed and whether any of his success actually meant anything. The one who wanted to matter, but didn't know if the things he'd done to matter had actually mattered at all or if he'd just been chasing ghosts. He wrote for hours, and as he wrote, something shifted. Something that had been locked up so tight for so long that he'd almost forgotten it existed. Something that had been compressed and suppressed and hidden away beneath layers and layers of performance and persona and constructed identity. He felt real, not the performance of realness, not the carefully constructed vulnerability that he sometimes deployed on his talk show when he wanted to connect with a guest or make a moment feel more intimate, not the strategic honesty that was designed to make people trust him more. But actual, genuine, terrifying realness. The kind that came from speaking the truth that nobody wanted to hear. The kind that came from admitting things you were supposed to hide. The kind that came from being so honest that it felt dangerous. That it was dangerous. And it did feel dangerous. Because once you admitted this, once you said out loud that you'd spent 30 years erasing yourself in service of an empire, you couldn't go back. You couldn't just put the mask back on and pretend you didn't know what was underneath. You couldn't unsee what you'd seen. You'd glimpsed behind the curtain. You'd seen the machinery. You'd understood how the magic trick was done. And you couldn't experience the magic the same way ever again. But there was something else too. Underneath the fear, underneath the danger, underneath the awareness of everything he'd lost in the pursuit of success, there was something that felt a lot like relief. Like putting down a weight he'd been carrying for 30 years without even realizing he was carrying it. Like someone had said, "You can stop now. You can put it down. You don't have to perform anymore." Like finally being able to breathe. Really breathe. From his actual lungs. Not the performed breathing that was part of the act. Steve kept writing as the sun came up. He wrote through the morning as the light changed from gray to orange to full, harsh daylight. He wrote past noon, his fingers moving across the keyboard with an urgency that didn't require conscious thought. He wrote until his fingers hurt and his eyes burned and his vision started to blur slightly from the strain. And the coffee beside him, he didn't even notice when it went cold. Didn't notice when it would have been the moment to get up and refresh it. He just kept writing. The words pouring out faster than he could think them. Like something inside him had opened up, and all the things he'd been holding back for 3 decades were finally being released. When he finally stopped, exhausted and exhilarated and terrified in equal measure, he sat back in his chair and he looked at what he'd written. It filled page after page. Thousands of words. More than he'd written in any single sitting in recent memory. And it was nothing like his usual writing. It wasn't polished. It wasn't constructed with the precision he usually brought to his work. It wasn't designed to please anyone or serve any corporate purpose or sell anything. It was messy. It was raw. It was sometimes incoherent because he'd been writing faster than his thoughts could organize themselves. It was vulnerable in a way that made him uncomfortable even looking at it. But it was true. It was the most honest thing he'd written in 30 years. And he knew, with a certainty that was both thrilling and terrifying, that this was what the kid had been pointing at. Not the game show stage. Not the persona. Not the empire that had been so carefully constructed. But the actual person underneath. The one who'd been buried so deep that Steve himself had almost forgotten he existed. The one who had actual thoughts that weren't designed to sell anything. The one who had genuine doubts instead of performed certainty. The one who could be wrong without it threatening his entire identity. The real Steve Harvey was still in there. And he was angry. Not angry in a way that was bitter or vengeful, but angry in the way you get angry when you realize you've been betrayed. And the betrayer was yourself. Angry that he'd spent 30 years becoming someone other than who he actually was. Angry that the empire had cost him so much more than he'd realized at the time. Angry that it had taken a kid on a game show stage to make him see what had been happening all along. Angry that he'd let it happen. And that anger, that raw, dangerous, authentic anger, was about to change everything.